Now, in the previous video, we identified the articulating bones at the hinge joints and at the ball and socket joints. Now we need to take that a little bit further, and you can see that you need to know the types of movements at both hinge joints and ball and socket joints. So let's look at hinge joints first. So we need to know the types of movements and to be able to apply them to practical examples. So a reminder that our hinge joints are the knee and the elbow. And we talked about this last time, but just to reiterate, the types of movement then at the knee and the elbow are flexion, and the other one's coming up in a minute. So flexion is when we make the angle of the joint smaller. So if we look at this bicep curl here, we can see the lady holding the bicep curl. If she'd started with the bicep curl out here with her arms straight, and she's moving it towards her shoulder up here, we're making the angle here smaller. So that's what we mean by flexion. So one example could be the bicep curl. Think of another example for yourself. You might want to think about throwing a football in from the sideline, where we put the ball over our head and bend our arms, we flex our arms. That's another example of flexion just before we throw the ball in. Okay, so the other movement is extension. And if we look at the knee here for this one, what we're doing here is we're straightening, in this case, the leg. If it was extension of the elbow, we'd be straightening the arm there. So if flexion is making the angle smaller, then extension is making the angle at the joint bigger or increasing it. And this one here, you can see she's pretty much got it as full as she possibly can. So extension is increasing the angle at the joint. And an example I have for you, in this case, it could be a gymnast straightening his or her legs. It could be if we're doing a squat and we're standing up and straightening our legs. That would be another example of extension. It could be if we're kicking a football or a rugby ball, when we straighten our leg after we've made contact with the ball. All of those are examples of extension. Let's pop over and look at the ball and socket joints. A reminder, first of all, that we're talking about the shoulders and the hips, and we need to look at the types of movement. There are a lot more movements here available at the shoulders and the hips at the ball and socket joints than there are at the knee and the elbow. So first of all, if we look at this image here, we're looking at the hip here, and we're looking at this, the thigh being moved up towards the chest. And so this movement here is flexion, and remember, flexion is making the angle of the joint smaller. So you need to be thinking about an example of when that might take place. So if you're doing a squat and you've got both feet on the ground and you're moving your backside down towards the ground, you're actually flexing at the hip there, and you're making that angle smaller. So that would be a good example of flexion. And if you look at this image here, you can see that the hip is being extended. So we've got extension here. So the angle there at the hip is being increased. So extension there. And that would be the same if we're doing our squat, or if we're doing a vertical jump, that would be straightening at the hips there. Now this image here is of the lady bringing her knee out towards us as we're looking at it. And this is moving the limb away from the midline of the body, and that is called abduction. So if we're taking a limb away from the midline of the body, that is abduction. And then this image here shows that the leg there has been moved towards the midline of the body, and that is called adduction. So remember, abduction to take away, you're abducted by aliens, you're taken away, and adduction is taken to the midline of the body. Now let's have a look at these last two movements, because they're similar but they're slightly different. The first one is rotation, and this is where the rotation is taking place at the shoulder here, but the movement is actually occurring at the forearm. In this case, he's playing a top hand spin in table tennis, where he's moving his arm around or over the top of the ball. So you can see that there's a rotation taking place there. And the last one there is circumduction, where the arm makes a big circular movement around the shoulder joint. And your example there is your bowling in cricket.